She leaned over his shirt as if fixing a wrinkle, fingers careful on woven navy silk, close enough to smell the citrus of his cologne and the faint, unplaceable scent of office coffee. Her voice was a breath against his ear, too soft to alarm the room, but sharp enough to cut through the morning. "Don't go. Your driver has a gun." Charles Whitmore's hand steeled on the cup. The gesture that had sealed deals and settled disputes with a single glance froze like a photograph. He didn't jerk away. He let her finish, let the words settle into the small, boxed air of his private suite above the estate. Outside, the world kept moving. A gardener's radio, the muffled throttle of a delivery truck, a fountain tracing a slow circle in the courtyard. Inside, the silk between Amara's fingers felt real and small. The danger did not. She had been doing this work, smoothing collars, folding napkins, making beds, long enough to know the usefulness of being unseen. She had learned to travel the thin seam between visibility and oblivion. Quiet kept her safe. Quiet kept the family intact. Quiet had been survival. On the morning she straightened the CEO's tie, she chose to break that rule. Charles lifted his chin and met her gaze for the briefest beat. He was a man who measured things carefully, not afraid, not careless. "You saw something," he said. "No," she lied with a tilt of her head. A lie was simpler than a confession. She could have said the name of the man who had shoved her in the pantry 2 nights before, Victor, the driver with the too loud laugh and the habit of calling the staff "you people." She could have said she had heard the clink of a metal outline in his pocket, or watched the way his hand hovered near the mat on his seat. But she let it be small. The room already knew too much. He put his cup down. He straightened the tie with 2 deft fingers, then stopped. "Get security," he said to no one and to her all at once. He did not ask how she knew. Asking would have made her vulnerable again. Daniel was in the corridor before the words had fully left the suite. Broad shoulders, a cropped beard, always 2 steps ahead. He moved through the staff with a pragmatic face, the kind of man who cataloged threats in neat lists. His voice was in the doorway before him. "Sir, what's—" "Don't tell me," Charles cut in. "Check the car. Stay with Eli." Eli, the boy with the dust of adolescence and a habit of falling asleep in meetings, was more than a client. The child's presence narrowed the world into urgent domestic geometry, small, precious, fragile. Amara's fingers brushed the knot once more, as if to anchor herself to the ordinary. She had been paid to preserve those small lines of life. A housekeeper's vigilance had always been domestic: spilled coffee, torn hems, a child's missing sock. Now it stretched a level of consequence she had not allowed herself to imagine. Daniel's team found the gun as if it had always been waiting to be found.
It was tucked under the passenger seat, a dark, compact thing that made the air feel colder once exposed. A man with gloved hands lifted it like a confession. He read the hotel bright stencil of serial numbers as if those symbols would explain motive. No one in the room wanted to say the words that hung above them. Planted, assigned, professional. The gun answered one question and birthed a dozen others. Charles's reaction was simple and quick. He called. He canceled the departure. He called Daniel again and told him to run the incoming plate numbers for the last 48 hours. He closed the suite door and drew the blinds down a notch. From the bureau of decisions he made, one had the sense of a man attempting to reassert control over a map that was, for the first time in years, not entirely his to read. No one disciplined Amara. No reprimand arrived to remind her of the house rules. For once, the silence that had been her armor bent toward recognition instead of erasure. Charles placed a hand on the small of her back for a beat. No familiarity, just a steadying touch. "Wait in the kitchen," he told her. "Stay where I can find you." She could have melted back into the staff rooms and let the professionals sweep the property and call federal numbers and do the kind of work that had names and badges. She could have kept being invisible. Instead, she stayed where he could find her. It was not bravery. It was not a plan. It was the same small thing that had propelled her through years of making beds in the dark. She refused to let the world rewrite the people she loved into casualties. The estate's kitchen was a cathedral of small noises: simmering stockpots, the drumming of a fighter's hand on a mixer, the squeal of a tray cart slipping over tile. Amara stood by a stainless counter and let the rhythm of work steady the tremor in her wrist. The other staff moved around her with the soft choreography of decades. They did not look at one another. A glance could become a story. Daniel came back and closed the kitchen door quietly. He had the kind of face that didn't show questions until after he'd considered the answers. He told her matter-of-fact who Victor was. Driver for the house for 3 years. No record of disciplinary incidents. Quiet on paper. A history of trivial complaints. Late to pickups. Snappy with the staff. The sort of not-quite records that evaporate when someone powerful smiles and pays the fine. Someone put him in to be close, Amara said. Her voice felt foreign in the kitchen air, rawer than she intended. Someone put him there, Daniel agreed. Did he follow you? Say anything? She told him the shove. She did not say how the pantry floor had scraped her palm as she steadied herself. She did not say the words Victor had used, the ones designed to make people feel small. Daniel listened and took each detail like a file. He did not ask why she hadn't reported it. He did not need to. He cataloged instead.
The gun, he said, made what had been disrespect into intent. Charles called Margaret Rhee that afternoon. Margaret arrived with winter in her expression and with a directness that made the kitchen feel small. She carried a leather case and the sort of gaze that had measured heads across interrogation tables. Former counterintelligence, they'd brought her in for problems that did not belong to ordinary security briefs. People like Margaret did not care who had polished the silver. They cared about the things hidden behind the silver. She looked at Amara as if cataloging an ally. "Did you see anything else?" Margaret asked. Amara told her about the watch Victor wore. Heavy, brass, a piece more at home with the kind of men who thought time was currency. She told her about the cigarette seam in the driver's pocket that never burned down but lingered in the hollow of his jaw. She told her about the way he looked at the family, not just with contempt, but with the detached interest of someone supervising a living set. Margaret did not flinch. She made a small note on a sheet of paper and slid it into the case. "Good," she said. "You stay visible. Stay where people can find you. We will handle the rest." Amara read the instruction with an odd mixture of relief and fear. She had not thought of herself as someone the powers that be would handle in any capacity other than invisible labor. To have her visibility turned into protection felt like a kind of theft. Who had the right to see her? Who had the right to make her a witness? The first public ripple arrived in the form of a meeting. Charles insisted that Amara come. He did not explain to her why he wanted her presence as more than a witness. He only told his staff in a voice that made dissent seem silly. "She saw something. I value that." They met in a boardroom where light came in hard strips and power sat in chairs like a second, heavier skin. The table itself was long enough to be a C. Men and women took their places with the sort of civility that meant they had rehearsed restraint. Gerald Clean smiled and folded his hands. Martin Greaves had his pen ready. The cameras in the ceiling winked in silent rows. Amara sat close to the door, where she could see the hinges and the people who came and went. She tucked her hands under her skirt and let the room's language wash over her, like listening to a song on the edge of knowing the chord. In the meeting, they found a tiny metallic chip lodged under the lip of a decorative bowl, the sort of thing a housekeeper would notice because it didn't belong, a smudge in a line of polish, a microphone's hairline seam. Her fingers had smoothed that bowl the day before. That was the kind of small infractions she had always seen and catalogued without consequence. Martin held up the chip with a gloved hand. "Plantable," he said. "Audio feed. Concealed." They ran through names with mechanical steadiness. "Board sweep," said Charles. "Full audit."
He looked at Amara as if to say, "You were right to notice." He leaned forward and, for one heartbeat, the room was no longer full of poker faces. It was full of people who had been startled awake. A sweep turned into a bruise of shock. In the estate study, behind a false seam in the millwork, technicians found an array of devices that mapped curiously to rooms throughout the property. The server list read like a small, private surveillance economy. Feed after feed with timestamps, operator logs, annotations in code no one in the room could read at first glance. Margaret watched these records with the expression of someone who had seen centralized control hands in worse places. "This is professional," she said. "This is wide." Amara was led to a bank of monitors in a room that smelled faintly of dust and coffee and server heat. She pressed her palms to the ledge and saw herself in 100 little windows, carrying a tray, evening lighting candles, a younger Amara coaxing Eli back to sleep. The footage was not voyeurism as entertainment. It was cataloging of private habits, the archivist's slow recording of small human patterns. She had never felt so exposed and so naked and so oddly documented in her life. In one tiny frame from 2 months prior, she watched a figure stand at the edge of the estate lawn and brood like a question. The man stood still in the small winter light, hands in his pockets, the posture of a person waiting for something to happen. Next to him, a car idled, and someone in the driver's seat looked toward the house. She had not remembered that night. The memory was a ghost. Margaret did not speak much. She let the monitor supply the story. Daniel leaned against the steel rack like a man with regret. "This isn't a single trespass," he said. "This looks networked." They decided to expand the search beyond the walls. Funds were corporate, but influence had contours and private pockets. Charles agreed to move quickly. A public whisper of surveillance could ruin corporate maneuvering in a day and the family in a minute. He called in favors quietly, pressing old allies into service and opening doors that were locked for everyone else. From private council rooms to anonymous tips, a trail began to assemble itself. A name here, a shell company there, transactions in account ledgers that did not match procurement orders. Each file read like a small wound. Amara watched how things shifted when she stopped being a background figure. People who had barely acknowledged her presence began to measure their language in her direction. Gerald's polite smile hardened when she entered the room. Vanessa Sloane, who sat at the marble coffee table on the 20th floor with a cigarette poised like a prophecy, softened for nobody. Vanessa's fall from grace had been a public thing. She was as careful as a cut wire and as dangerous. Someone found a photograph in an envelope with an anonymous stamp.
It was small and glossy and showed Marcus, her brother, with a face that leant into the camera without the armor of suspicion. A yellowed slip of paper had been folded and tucked behind it. On the margin, a scrawl that read like a promise. Amara's breath caught in a way she had not expected. Marcus had moved to the city to take a job in a shipping warehouse. He had also been vocal about housing for the elders in their neighborhood, a small, righteous thorn in the side of developers. The note implied nothing specific and everything imaginable. She had carried Marcus's picture in her wallet until the day the leather gave. She had not told him about the incident in the pantry. She had not told him she feared for his safety. The photograph in the envelope felt like a breach of the small world she had kept to herself. It made the danger personal in a way the technical files had not. "You need to go talk to him," Daniel said softly. He did not say it like an order, but the tone was clear. Protect the family. Protect the connections. People like Daniel assumed that threats could be reduced to tactics. He was a man for whom anxiety was a spreadsheet. Amara nodded, then did not move. She thought of the risk of visibility, the way one might measure gusts before stepping into a storm. Visibility was safety when it was sanctioned and watched. Visibility was danger when it was weaponized. Her life had been a pattern of choosing small invisibilities for the sake of larger survival. Now she was being asked to invert that pattern, to let the public eye, and these men and women with gloves, make her known. Charles found a quiet to himself and to her. He asked simply whether she wanted anything. He did not seem a man who was used to being refused. "You did what you had to do," he said. "If you want to sit in meetings, you will sit here. If you want nothing to do with my world, we'll respect that. But know this. I don't want you at risk because of a service I command. If someone put Victor there for any reason other than convenience, I'd see that they're gone. On my watch, that won't happen." Amara understood the weight of that promise. It offered shelter, but also a chain. To accept was to need to be visible. To refuse was perhaps to lose the leverage of being protected. There was in that exchange the old dynamic of power redeployed, the wealthy man offering safety on terms of inclusion. She had for years accepted such bargains in smaller forms. She had accepted a comfortable lane in exchange for her silence. She chose to go to the workroom instead. "What are you doing?" Margaret asked later, when Amara had moved to the small office where the cleaning supplies were cataloged. She had been given a small badge, an identification that allowed her into meetings, into the server room, into the staff floor. The badge looked wrong against her simple cardigan. It was an emblem that promised the visibility she had avoided. "I'm watching," Amara said.
Margaret looked at her once, then at the monitors that mapped the estate in green lines. "Then watch properly," she said. "Notice hands. Notice timings. Notice what people don't say and what they do when they think no one's looking." That was the first lesson that would change the shape of Amara's days. She had always watched, but never in the deliberate, investigative way Margaret proposed. To watch properly was to gather a language that would matter in courtrooms and boardrooms, time-stamped, doors logged, habits recorded. The house handed her tiny keys to new doors. She was allowed to sit in a private corner during briefings. She was given a notebook that felt ceremonial in its first blankness. She wrote with a borrowed pen. She took to naming small patterns, the way Gerald checked the edges of his cuff when speaking of contracts, the way Vanessa's right thumb pressed against the cigarette when she lied. She learned to notice how the cleaning team scheduled their rounds and how the gardener's truck changed its timing when shipments arrived. The investigation expanded outward like a shadow. They were no longer simply sweeping the house, they were following threads that showed a web. Victor's employment check softened into a pattern. Small payments, consulting fees, appeared in a ledger linked to a shell company that, though anonymous, had an address in the same county where a low-profile biotech firm had its registered office. The name Elbridge appeared again and again, not with a flourish, but with the steady, faceless hand of money trying to look like a clean instrument. Charles was not a man who let his wealth protect him from reality. He wanted answers that could be acted on. He wanted to know whether the threat to his family was an isolated act of hatred or the outward expression of a system that had grown teeth. When he spoke about accountability, he used the word as if it were a small physical object, something to be placed on the table and examined. Margaret had a different vocabulary. She used phrases like operational footprint and influence nodes. She wanted to see the scaffolding of the enterprise. Where Charles asked the questions that mattered to the family, Margaret asked the questions that mattered to federal indictments. Amara, in the intersection between those two lexicons, found a new rhythm. She moved through rooms as she always had, but now her hands lingered on the underside of drawers. Her eyes noted the wear on a particular stair tread, the way a family photograph angled ever so slightly toward a window. Little violences in objects told stories. In the months of her life that followed, it would be those small observations that turned pulp files into prosecutable narratives. They discovered the first clear trace of external orchestration on a rainy Thursday. A vendor's van had been photographed idling at the lower gate at an odd hour.
When Margaret's team traced the vehicle, it led to a cluster of addresses in a town upstate. The trail ran cold, and then warm, and then cold again, as shell companies and false names jostled for space in a ledger. Someone was moving money with the care of a person who feared exposure but relied on the infrastructure of deniability. Vanessa Sloane surfaced then, as if drawn by the scent of a fish caught in a net. She sat with Margaret in a private room and made a decision that would change the tenor of what followed. Vanessa was not repentant. She was careful and precise, giving up a name and a location as if negotiating a price. She described meetings in hushed tones, meetings attended by mid-level compliance officers and a man named Elias Kane, who had the habit of staying in the corner and writing notes. She didn't love the man. She feared him. Amara listened and tightened her hands on the pen. She had known Vanessa in the periphery of circles where favors traded like currency. Now Vanessa's words drew a picture with a center, a financier who liked to move shadows through other people's hands, a man who trusted enforcers who would not be traipsed back to his door. The more they scraped, the more they found. A contractor with a bland meme had booked a maintenance slot in the estate and had never been seen again. His invoices matched a payroll that did not line up with human resources. An account in the name of a nonprofit bore a line item that, upon further inspection, said research facilitation and corresponded with a lab in the Catskills. The lab, Elbridge, had a benign outward face, grant proposals, glossy brochures, an academic veneer, but beneath the veneer, the file suggested a pattern, a readiness to experiment in the legal gray. Clinical research is complicated, Margaret said once, when the word experiments sputtered through the group like an accusation. But what we're seeing is design, not accident. There are patterns of selection. There are habits of surveillance. It's not random. Amara found herself thinking of Elena, the child whose bench in the estate garden would be, in years to come, engraved with a name, of the small private harms that accumulate into a public injury. The files had a careful cruelty to them, records that were thin but persistent, like a fine hairline crack running through glass. They did not show the obvious. They showed the slow, patient ordering of access and interest. It was surveillance, not as passion, but as engineering. Other people began to notice Amara's presence in the way someone notices a new streetlight in a neighborhood. It changed the rhythm of casual cruelty. Victor drew his shoulders in at the edges of corridors. He stopped calling the staff "you people" so loudly. In private, he kept his hands in his pockets like a man who had learned the lesson of being watched. Amara's notebook filled up. She wrote events down in small, careful script. Times, faces, odors, the small weather of each moment. The notebook grew into a map. Minor patterns began to feel like addresses. Where once a stain on a tablecloth was an annoyance, it became a location where a microchip had been concealed. Where once a driver had been an irritant, he became a node in a net. The family, the estate, the boards and formalities, they all seemed to be a skin stretched over a network of levers. Once one began to press them, the inside revealed gears. Old favors called in, legal embargoes negotiated, apologies written and retracted. The first legal teams were reticent. Complex money flowed through jurisdictions like dye through water. But federal interest had been piqued. Margaret had old channels that smelled faintly of cold coffee and late-night intel sessions. She used them with the kind of economy that made people call her efficient and ruthless in the same breath. Then the photograph arrived. Marcus cornered by a sliver of paper. It felt less like evidence and more like a hand on the back of her neck. The note suggested attention. Attention in a surveillance economy was not neutral. It was a weapon. Amara folded the picture over and over in her mind. She had friends at work who would tell her to go to the police and to seek a protection order. She had family who would tell her to leave, to find a new apartment, to sever ties. She had a brother who would laugh at the idea that dangerous men might be interested in him. The house that morning had been a place of service. Now it had become an orbit, with a center of power and a periphery of risk. "You're not alone in this," Charles told her, in a voice that was softer than the one he used with staff. He did not promise violence-free futures. He promised to use what resources he had to change the risk calculus. It was not the same as saying he could erase danger. It was the next best thing, making sure many eyes could see when a shadow moved. Amara stared at the photograph again and tucked it into the back of her notebook like an accusation. Her choice was not a heroic pivot. She did not envision glory or a neat unspooling of villains into defeat. She saw instead a narrowing, a pathway where she could stand with her eyes open, refusing to let the parts of life that mattered to her be defined by other people's cruelty. When the team traced the shell company a week later, the name Elbridge kept returning like a footnote. Margaret suggested a quick, quiet recon, a drive to the Catskills. No charges yet, only reconnaissance. Amara felt a pull in the base of her skull, an animal recognition that the map of danger had just expanded. She thought of the drives she had once made back home, the long blacktop with its sudden folds, and her brother's laugh in the back seat over a tape they both loved. She volunteered. Margaret looked at her with a new appraisal. "You don't have to come," she said.
"I will," Amara answered. The decision was small. It was also monumental. It moved her from being an observer inside the estate to someone who would stand on a road outside a lab and watch its lights with other people's creased faces. It meant that the world would now have an inventory of her movements. It meant risk. It also meant possibility. They left at dawn, the kind of early so pale it seemed cautious. In the van, Eric, a young tech who had burned the midnight oil cleaning code in a cafe until his eyes were rimmed with red, clicked through a map frozen along routes and IP ranges. Margaret slept for a moment under the slope of her scarf, a small island in the landscape of motion. Charles did not come. He trusted his team and his judgment. He stayed on the estate, anchored to action. The Catskills Road wound like a thought across the landscape. It belonged to the world of small industrial parks and poker-faced offices that pretended to be ordinary. Their rental car arrived at a nondescript gate that could be a farm entrance if one only glanced. The sign read, plainly, Elbridge Bio Research, LLC. The letters were matte and careful, as if to suggest legitimacy. Margaret's voice was low as she reviewed their plan. "We don't go in," she said. "We watch. We see who comes and goes. We look for the sequencing. If they're sloppy, we'll have our case. If they stop being sloppy, that tells us something too." Amara stood a few yards from the gate and watched a woman inside the lab lower a box into a car. The woman moved briskly, practiced, like someone who had rehearsed efficiency until it looked natural. Amara's attention locked onto the license plate and into a small inventory in her mind. She wrote in her notebook the kind of things she told herself she would never reveal to anyone. The number of trucks that arrived between 9 and noon, the way the security guard smoked a cigarette far from the door, the texture of the wind that made the paper on their clipboard shiver. They left with nothing yet and everything, a picture of a shipping manifest that would not be admissible in court until properly authenticated, a thread of suspicion that would have to be spun carefully. On the ride back, Eric leaned his forehead against the window and made a sound that could be read as worry. Margaret mapped the data into cones of probability. Amara watched the long line of trees and tried to imagine the life her brother had forged in the city, in the noise and the small fighting. Back at the estate, the monitoring system pinged with a small alert that made the team's phone lines glow.
Someone had accessed a feed at 3 in the morning. The timestamp was marginally shifted by 48 minutes. The name attached to the access was a code. Eric frowned. "That's a routed link," he said, "not from our network." They moved into a different kind of hustle. The legal teams began to whisper about subpoenas.
The communications team began to draft what would be said to the press if the story leaked. The board's faces hardened. Amara's small notebook grew a new weight in her bag. The photograph of Marcus moved under the pin in the notebook like a small hinge. When she went home that night, the apartment felt like a place someone had left a light on for her. Marcus greeted her with a laugh and a story about a broken pallet at work. He cooked a small meal, pasta with basil from a plastic pot on his fire escape. They sat on the edge of an overused couch and talked like ordinary siblings, which meant safe, but now details, small teasing. He did not ask about the estate. He did not want to be dragged into anything that might make his life narrower and harder. She told him some things, not everything, enough to warn him to keep his head down, enough to tell him the family might ask him to stay off social media for a while. Marcus listened the way he always had, half distracted, half steadfast. He treated danger like a fly that would either buzz around until it tired or be swatted away. He was younger than Amara's fears allowed him to be. When she left his apartment that night, she felt the thin blade edge of responsibility settle across her shoulders. She had made herself visible. Visibility had teeth. It also had the chance to bite back at those who thought themselves untouchable. The next morning, the house returned to its quiet choreography as if nothing had shifted. People moved through their tasks with the same mechanical grace, but the air had a tension to it, like a plucked string that might snap. Amara went back to straightening ties because it was the thing she had always done when nothing else could be done. Each time her fingers hovered near a knot now, the memory of Victor lurked, his shove in the pantry, the way his keys jingled with an impatient menace. She was beginning to catalog not just objects but intentions, the difference between a glance and a look that planned to return. She had been trained in patience by poverty and by the long, careful economies of service. Now patience was tactical. It was the slow accumulation of data until a pattern so undeniable it required a name. In her notebook, between the listing of comings and goings, she wrote a single sentence. "For those who are watched, the watch becomes their fate." She underlined it once and then closed the book. Margaret called a meeting. The room was tight with low light and the hum of servers. On a table, a USB stick, small, black, anonymous, waited like a secret. Vanessa had brought it. She had brought it like a negotiator placing a piece on the table. It existed as barter and as evidence. The stick contained records that pointed to a contractor whose name matched an invoice in a shell company, whose invoices linked, finally, to a number that led back to Elias Kane. Amara felt something cold press into her ribs when the name was spoken.
Kane was a name that carried with it the sound of heavy money rolling in a quiet room. He did not do the work himself. He financed it. He bought deniability like a person buys art, because it conferred status. To meet him was to meet the shape of someone who could move satellites and make people disappear from ledgers. "We have to move carefully," Margaret said. "Any overt action now makes us vulnerable to countermeasures, but passivity gives them time to bury tracks. We need evidence, and we need a way to bring them into a place where they can be confronted with it." Charles tapped the table once, cadence precise. "We bring the facts to the federal people Margaret trusts. We do not go public. Not yet." Amara listened to the legalese and the categoricals and felt like a leaf in a room of cogs. She had no legal training, but she had a rhythm of observation. She had an eye for the small things that betrayed larger lies. She was no longer merely a keeper of silverware. She had become a witness in a story that stretched farther than any lavatory inventory list. And then the thread tightened. The team traced invoices and emails and small, careful notes in code. Eric, who now spent less time at a cafe and more time in front of servers, found an IP ping that matched a remote node in a storage locker in a neighboring county. A physical inventory of that locker, if recovered, might shed light on how the surveillance had been staged. It might show connections to Kane's shell operations, or it might show nothing at all. The margin here was thin. They prepared to move. Margaret briefed the team not to engage with federal cover. "We can do reconnaissance," she said, "but arrests, seizures, those are not ours. We will document and present." Amara's hands tightened around the edge of her chair. She had a picture of Marcus tucked into her notebook.
She had a fatherless household she had spent years kind of patching back together. She thought of all the small harms that could be inflicted because someone assumed the world would not notice. She also thought of Charles's steadying hand, of Daniel's blunt care, of Margaret's cold competence that felt both like an edge and an umbrella. When the team went out to the neighboring county, Amara did not go in the same way she had gone to the Catskills. This time she moved as part of a coordinated plan. Cameras and phones recorded everything. Legs of evidence walked forward in the light. The storage locker yielded a crate of innocuous things, maintenance gear, alongside the small, unglamorous tools of a surveillance entrepreneur, chip devices, encrypted drives, 1 or 2 handheld recorders. There was also a binder that cataloged feed dates and times on an index that used names she recognized: Eli's room, the study, the flowered guest wing. Amara's breath left her in a shudder. To see Eli's room cataloged in a binder was to see her private life itemized.
She had imagined such lists in the worst corners of sleepless nights. She had never expected to touch the paper in someone else's hands. They took everything to Margaret. She called the federal contacts she had known from past lives, people who answered numbers late at night and who had the patience for the dry arithmetic of a case. The response was not an immediate swarm. Federal agents moved when the paper trail and the risk matched the law. It was, Margaret explained, a slow machine. They had to fit their puzzle into the machine's teeth. Amara understood that change would not be instantaneous. Justice often moved like a tide, but the tide was a long swell. The small wins came in stages: an access log authenticated, a phone trace confirmed, a small shell company dissolved. Each proved the case a little more, and made visceral the idea that someone with numbers and a conscience could be brought to account. As they boxed up the evidence, as Vanessa smoked and rubbed the pad of her thumb against the side of her cigarette, as Daniel made a list of people to be questioned officially, Amara watched a tiny thing on the floor, a fraying of the carpet thread near the main entry. A place like that could hide a microphone if it were made to. Her fingers brushed it, and then a technician with gloved hands was already kneeling there. She had moved a little farther from invisible without meaning to. Visibility had a cost, yes, but it also had teeth. In the late afternoon, she found herself in the study again, staring at the bank of monitors. A new feed flickered. A clip. A new feed flickered. A clip from a night 2 weeks earlier, grainy and blue-lit, the camera angled from the hedgerow like a guilty eye. A man moved across the periphery, then froze at the side of the house. He reached into a pocket and, in a single, decisive motion, slid something small and metallic beneath the lip of a decorative planter. The frame froze on the wrist, a heavy brass watch, its face catching a streetlight. Amara's fingers tightened on the ledge until the knuckles whitened. That watch was Victor's. Margaret let the clip play twice and then turned the speakers down as if sound might make what they had seen any more real. It was the sort of evidence that did not solve mysteries by itself. It supplied the rhythm of suspicion. But Margaret's eyes, the ones that had learned years ago to read pattern where others saw only static, did not need more than a repeated frame. That's placement, she said, not a random wanderer, someone who knew what to leave and where. The lead went taut. Eric traced the camera's feed and the timestamps and found a route that connected the night to a local maintenance company, to an invoice, to a name that reappeared in Vanessa's USB. The trail bent and folded through shell accounts until it stopped at a contractor who had billed the estate under maintenance work 3 months prior. He had never signed in at the main gate.
His work was listed under miscellaneous procurement. The simplicity of the deception made it brutal. Get in under the noise, place the tool, pull the strings. Charles listened to the tidy explanation, and then, in the way he always did when facts risked emotion, asked the quietest practical question. Where is Victor right now? He gave an address. He knew where people worked and where they slept. It was a small mercy of old money, the file systems that mapped lives. The team moved with a sanctioned speed. Margaret called the federal contact she trusted, an agent whose badge had a slow integrity and whose voice had answered Margaret at 3 a.m. years before. The agent took the summary and did not promise fireworks. She promised a presence, surveillance set, a warrant request in motion, and a restraint on actors who were not law enforcement. Margaret liked the agent's cadence. It meant they would be able to act without anyone being able to credibly cry foul later. They watched Victor the way a careful eye watches a thread on a sweater. He arrived for a midday pickup, his hands lighter than usual on the van's steering wheel. On a receptionist's phone, his name came up for an oil change and a routine inspection. He met the contractor he used to coordinate with at a diner off the highway. They spoke in the way of men who traded in schedules and numbers. The contractors were not glamorous people. They were tidy, gray, people who could be asked to make things happen and who accepted the bland moral terms of being useful. Video showed Victor sliding an envelope across the table.
The contractor's hand closed on it like a machine acknowledging a function. Margaret sat in the van beside Daniel and watched the loop play. "We don't need to scare him into confession," she said. "We need a moment where he has no useful outs." That moment arrived the way Margaret predicted: routine, sudden, legal. Federal agents shadowed the contractor's route and hid a storage locker affiliated with his company. Inside, they found small devices, chips, wiring, an array of storage drives, and a ledger with dates and addresses. Among the entries, a shorthand line linked payments to Victor's union of dates. It was enough to show that Victor was not a lone wolf. He was a node. Victor was taken in a quiet manner. Law enforcement did the work that private citizens could not do. Warrants served, rights read, chain of custody recorded. Daniel stood near the edges and maintained his practical composure. For Amara, it was the most violent thing she had seen and the most contained. Men in uniforms escorting a man she had shared a corridor with, the way the world rearranged itself to fold a person into a file. When Victor's lawyer spoke, promising defense and denials, he did not seem to have the brass watch on his wrist. In detention, the watch that had been a detail of menace shed its meaning, reduced to an object held behind a transparent screen.
Margaret's team did not expect an immediate confession. They expected the slow unspooling of a person who, when pressed by legal facts, might recall names he had been told to forget. They expected resistance and negotiation, and the long, small undermining that law does to scheming. What surprised them was Victor's voice when he finally leaned into the question of who he answered to. He did not name Kane on the first day. He named smaller men, the contractors who had paid, the mid-level people at procurement who had made cash flows possible. He named Gerald, for convenience, for habit, and a ledger that moved in circles. He said that some orders came with a face or a thump of promise, others came with an envelope and a note. He described a method: get close, feed what you need, stay unseen. He said the name Elias Kane only when the evidence on the table had become too heavy to ignore. He named him as someone who did not sign his orders directly, someone who bought the infrastructure and let other hands use it. Victor did not appear brave in his telling. He appeared pragmatic, small, someone who had traded his ethics for a salary blister. Margaret and the federal agent listened with the same calm attention that had been their hallmark in war rooms and depositions. When Victor offered to cooperate, to hand over anything he had in exchange for leniency, Margaret allowed herself a brief assessment. He would be useful if he told truth, and if his testimony could be corroborated by material evidence. They manufactured corroboration: drives retrieved from storage units, phone logs with partial traces, and, most crucially, a flash of alignment with the dates in the ledger the team had already built. Vanessa's USB played a part in the choreography that followed. The documents it held were not cinematic smoking guns, but the careful drip of accounting irregularities, emails that hinted without being explicit, a spreadsheet with curious line items. The press, if fed at the wrong time, would reduce the whole thing to gossip. Margaret insisted on quietness and precision. They worked a rhythm: obtain evidence, authenticate it, route the discovery to federal partners, and prepare for a moment when the defendant would have nowhere to go. That moment had to be more than legal strategy. It had to remove the possibility of Kane's typical escape routes. He was a man who moved in private jets and nonprofits, and who had an airstrip he favored for discretion, an old asphalt runway hemmed by pines, and a short concrete apron that swallowed a private jet and a handful of SUVs. It was a place where a man could step from his bubble and into a waiting car with no public witnesses, a place where men in black suits thought themselves sovereign.
Margaret proposed a bait that married law and theater, a staged charity gala that would serve as a plausible reason for a private meeting and for an attendant logistical movement, an arrival on a small jet, an exchange of documents, a hurried private conversation. They crafted a story that made Kane think he was moving into a seam of influence control, an opportunity to buy silence rather than face exposure. Vanessa's contacts supplied a whispered invitation. The press, knowingly or not, printed an innocuous item about a private donor dinner. The team seeded digital echoes, a fake settlement memo, a quietly leaking rumor about a quiet payment. The point was to create a believable pressure that would cause Kane to appear where federal agents could lawfully intercept him. Amara listened to the plan and felt the old animal spike of fear, the recognition that a human life could be rearranged across a table. Her role, Margaret reminded her, would be observational and human. She would be one of the faces at the gala, visible so that any operative watching for the family's patterns would see a thread they would rather not touch. She would not be a tool of arrest. She would be a witness whose presence would throw off the enemy's assumptions. The gala night was a wet glitter of umbrellas and polished shoes. The ballroom smelled like flowers and wire-silvered butter, Waiters moved as if they carried the choreography of 1,000 similar nights. Amara wore a dress that sat modestly against her frame, a borrowed pin at her throat that glittered inconspicuously. She moved through rooms not with the practiced invisibility of years, but in the slow, deliberate course of someone who knew to see what people hid in plain view. Her notebook stayed closed in her purse. She had learned to let observation be quiet. Gerald moved through the crowd with the practiced charm of someone used to transactions that did not have to use words. He was smiling in public, and in private, precise. He drifted near the stage where a local artist gave a speech, and Amara watched the way his fingers found the edge of a tie, as if remembering a small ritual. The tie motif had followed her, like a quiet scar, a knot fixed, an instruction whispered. At the edges of the room, men in tailored coats whispered into sleeves. One of them swept his gaze across the crowd and paused at a woman who smoked like a man with history in his lungs, Vanessa, then moved on. A courier, a lower-level operative, brushed past the servers with his hands full of envelopes. He paused, then slid a small packet into a hostess's clutch, a black card, a mailing list, and innocuous key. Amara watched and noted the motion, the angle of the wrist. She drew the line from her notations to the feed they had watched in the server room. The wrist that reached for placement at 2 a.m. shared the same watch as the courier in the ballroom.
A sudden ripple of commotion at a side entrance fractured the evening. 2 men hurried, faces tense. A contractor and an associate who seemed surprised by an extra pair of headlights. Daniel, who had been near the service entrance under the pretense of being in charge of logistics, moved before anyone could process a threat. Security gently but firmly herded guests away from the arch of light at the door. Margaret called the federal contact and spoke in words that were quiet and fierce and exact. Victor tried to slip into the back of a service van. A team of agents who had been waiting in the wings under warrants and court orders moved in. He froze, the way people do when they notice they are no longer actors but evidence. He looked for a single beat, like a person who had been surprised that the machinery he served had learned to aim back. They took him with no theatrics, just the firm, lawful steps of men who knew how to do something properly. In the van, under the hum of a heater and the smell of wet coats, Victor finally gave them what they needed to move the case forward. His hands shook as he recited names. He turned loose the ledger's code and spoke of drop locations and safe numbers and a small, specific phrase that had been used to approve surveillance placements. He spoke of Kane's indirect signatures, phrases inserted into emails that read like a man's private punctuation, payments that moved by cable with an extra flourish of a benign donor note. He handed over a thumb drive he said he had been paid to carry, to deliver instructions, and it contained a set of voice files and a spreadsheet that, when cross-referenced with Vanessa's USB, drew a line. They did not arrest Kane that night. He had not been present, and the law required they maintain their composure. But they had the courier's route, and the ledger, and the thumb drive, and a sequence of locations that made federal action inevitable. They had the legal cover to ask a judge for a warrant to intercept Kane's arrival at Elmcrest Airfield, a private strip with a pre-cleared travel pattern for men like him. The decision to make the airstrip the stage for an arrest was one Margaret framed as cautious necessity. Kane would fly in expecting discretion. The team would have federal agents in place to effect an arrest in the public sphere. They would not beset him at a private dinner. They would meet him where the law could act without accusation of entrapment. There would be no guns drawn by citizens. There would be process, papers, men with badges. On a pale, wind-blown morning, the jet cut the air and lowered toward the apron. The sky had the washed-out look of something that would keep secrets. Low, indifferent. People who did this work arrived early.
The team assembled with a practical calm. Agents with unvarnished badges, the legal counsel with their folders, Margaret with the wiry alertness that turned fear into problem-solving, and Amara, who had been asked to come with Charles as a steady presence. Charles stood near the front of his black SUV, coat tucked against the wind. He had chosen to be visible, both as a sign that he would not be kept in a room while others acted, and as a test of whether the world would honor that modest hubris. Amara had come because she had seen what needed to be seen, because her notebook had become an index of what lives looked like under watching. She was near enough to adjust ties if the world demanded it, far enough not to be accused of overreach. The plane's hatch hissed and then opened. Kane stepped out like a man who had rehearsed his own unremarkability. Good shoes, a coat cut for distance, a face that presented as bored. He had a small smile, as if the world were one of his fewer interesting problems. As he walked toward the cars waiting at the end of the runway, federal agents close in, calculated, procedural, lawful. Someone called his name and read the standard phrases. He paused at first, then smiled wider as if to break tension with charm. It did not work. "You don't have to do this," he said, words aimed like a casual coin that would buy off attention.
His gaze flicked once toward the assembled reporters at a safe distance, and then fell on Amara. He had not known she would be there. He did not expect to be recognized by a woman who had policed the edges of his construction. Amara had spent many years ensuring other people's collars sat right and other people's lives seemed arranged. She moved forward, not in a way that blocked the agents, but close enough for a small moment of human contact. She straightened the tie at the front of Kane's coat, the fabric dark and expensive. It was an odd, domestic gesture on an apron of asphalt. When her fingers brushed the knot, she did not look at Kane. She said, "Nothing loud, nothing theatrical. Visibility has consequences." Kane's eyes flicked to her with mild annoyance, thinking perhaps to dismiss the woman as something he could ignore. There was no apology, no charm. The agent stepped forward then, and the formal language of arrest took over. Kane's hands stayed roughly where they were until a badge was shown. His mouth worked at the idea of coercion, and then at the idea that brute process had cornered him. He did not shout. He counted on his lawyers to make procedural hay later. Victor's cooperation, the thumb drive evidence, and the ledger's cross-references made the federal case tangible. Kane was escorted to a federal vehicle under the eyes of television cameras and stacks of legal pads. He had been bought in his own medium, money and seclusion. Now he would be processed in the public meter of paperwork, arraignment, indictment.
He had expected to be able to buy time. He had not anticipated the slow, stubborn arithmetic of accountability. In the days that followed, the city bent toward legal heat. Kane's publicist filed the sort of statements that were designed to smear investigators rather than respond to facts. Alicia, the communications head for the estate, watched press cycles turn and crafted a measured release that stressed cooperation with federal authorities and a commitment to transparency. The smear attempts dissolved as journalists demanded documents and then sat in courtrooms as lawyers argued for and against gag orders. The public learned in increments: a prominent financier arrested, charges unsealed, evidence of an illicit network of surveillance and funding for questionable research. The stories did not read like a thriller. They read like the slow, legal persistence of paper and testimony. Amara found herself called into a deposition and then to the stand. The courtroom had the smell of old wood and dry air. She sat on a bench and watched the lawyers stand and ask their questions with the same thin politeness they used at board meetings. Under oath, she told the truth: the shove in the pantry, the watch, the way she had felt watched. She read from her notebook when asked. The pages were small evidence: dates, times, descriptions written in the economy of someone who had learned to keep records of daily life out of necessity. The defense tried the usual things, suggesting memory could be faulty, implying motive. But facts had a companion in the form of the drives and the ledger and the courier's receipts. Victor testified about placement details. Vanessa corroborated meetings. Margaret's forensic team authenticated timestamps. The federal agent explained chain of custody. Layers of small certainties stacked until they could support charges. Trial was not a dramatic catharsis. It was the public placement of private crimes, a measured procedural examination of acts that had been grown into a system. Jurors listened to carefully cross-referenced evidence and then deliberated. The legal victory, when it came, was not explosive. People celebrated with quiet relief. Amara did not feel triumphant. She felt exhausted and oddly emptied, as if several years of watchfulness had been hauled into a room and sorted. But there was also a sense of repair, seeds sown that might grow new behaviors. Victor, after his plea and testimony, entered a witness protection arrangement. He did not walk free in the old sense. He had, instead, the kind of bargain law sometimes makes: reduced sentence in exchange for full cooperation. Margaret observed the calculus with a professional chill. She had expected it. Amara watched him go and felt something like pity and strange relief. He had been, ultimately, a cog. Vanessa's cooperation was more fraught. In exchange for immunity, she provided documents and a willingness to testify about the funding networks.
Her posture in court was not humble. She remained a woman of tactics. She did not ask for redemption, only for lesser consequence than being in Kane's shadow forever.
Her testimony helped illustrate how influence moved in quiet channels, the research facilitation line items, the friendly memos that smoothed procurement. When asked under oath why she had participated, she said, simply, "I wanted power. I didn't want to know what it bought." Saying it so plainly did not make it less damaging to her. For Amara, the more intimate aftermath was less the trial than the small repairs that followed inside the estate and the lives around it. Daniel reorganized security protocols, not because Charles asked, but because the men and women who had trusted the estate as a safe workplace deserved more than lip service. There were new logs, better sign-in procedures, some retrenchment among vendors that refused to undergo transparency. The board initiated an ethics commission. Martin Greaves, who had been implicated through his sloppier checks, was put on leave pending review. It was imperfect, but it was tangible. The company instituted a partnership with local clinics and nonprofits to address the harms tied to Elbridge's work. They did not promise to absolve all the damage that had been done in other people's lives. They promised instead to fund oversight and reparation projects and to remove access to platforms that had been used to invade privacy. Margaret called these institutional reckonings necessary but not sufficient. Charles treated them like a moral ledger, small repairs made out of an obligation that wealth should mean responsibility, not immunity. Marcus came through with a rockier arc. He had felt the tug of fear and then insult. No one likes to be watched like prey. He left the city for a week under a new name and a friend's couch before he returned. Amara went to his apartment with soup and awkward jokes and the small domestic rituals that had always been their love language. He resumed work and began to consider part-time studies in community organizing, something that made him passionate. He grumbled about the ways wealthy people took up space, and his voice carried that stubborn tenderness that had always been his. He and Amara began, slowly, to stitch their lives back to something that felt less precarious. The estate changed too. Where the house's private habits had once been the object of unseen collection, the family now put processes in place that localized decision-making and banned certain categories of private work. They commissioned an independent audit of vendors. The gardens retained the beds that bore the name of Elena, and on a crisp morning Amara sat there once and opened the small journal Elena had left behind. She turned pages that a child's pen had inked, drawings of suns and a messy, hopeful list of animals, and felt finally something like permission to keep ordinary things again.
Charles kept his promise in a measured way. He made certain that the family's dealings would not be used as a shield for illicit interests. He became a public face in hearings about business ethics, careful and practical rather than grandstanding. In private, he was generous in surprising ways, insisting that staff be included in decisions about security, offering raises, and supporting a small scholarship for workers' children. He was still a man of power. Power, if anything, had become to him a responsibility that he wielded with a different, quieter hand. Amara's life rearranged itself along new axes. The promotion offer arrived in a thin envelope, not in a grand speech, but in a precise conversation. Martin's role as compliance head had become compromised. The board needed someone who had seen the house from the inside and who knew the seams where privacy had once been shredded. They wanted someone who understood both the dignity of ordinary labor and the demands of corporate governance. They offered her the title, EVP of Ethics and Oversight, a role conceived with the idea that she would bridge the institutional and the humane. She said she needed time. It was not a rejection, but a measured pause filled with practical questions and a private list of fears. The title would bring visibility in a way that would not always be pleasant. It would ask her to move from cleaning closets to confronting boardrooms. She had not trained for it, but she had trained in a different essential school, watching, remembering, and protecting the fragile lines of people's lives. She accepted eventually because the offer was, brutally and simply, an opportunity to shape the way those lines were kept. Her first days in the office were a study in translation. She navigated legal jargon and boardroom etiquette with help, learning how to read contracts for clauses that enabled obfuscation, how to ask the right custodial questions of procurement whispers. She started a program that elevated vendor transparency and instituted staff-led oversight committees. She hired people from the neighborhoods the estate touched. She insisted that those who had once been invisible be given seats at tables that had been used to make decisions about their lives. It wasn't a clean revolution. It was a painstaking bureaucracy of small policies and new calendars and the occasional backlash. But the ethos began to shift. What had been a private, insulated club turned into a place that had obligations outward. There were quieter, private moments that mattered more to Amara than titles. One afternoon she found herself in a meeting room where Eli fussed with a puzzle, his hair a tousle of boyhood. He looked up as she straightened a knot at his small shirt and asked simple and candid if she were going to be around more. Amara felt a small domestic skill that had always been hers. Make things fit, make them steady.
She sat and played the puzzle with him and found that gentleness was a kind of authority too. At public hearings, Margaret sat in the back like a small dark blade, watching how law worked when pressed by the public.
Margaret had not wanted the platform, she wanted outcomes. She took satisfaction in seeing contracts rewarded and a few board members lose their comfortable presumption. She also cautioned Amara against an easy triumph. "Watch the edges," she would say. "People learn to hide behind new words. Watch the seams." Months became seasons. The trial concluded, the sentencing and civil suits followed in legal time that felt interminable but just. Kane's sentence was measured in years and in ordered restitution. He maintained his composure with the same practiced detachment at the airstrip. That did not comfort the families who had been touched by his web. It did not cure the quiet injuries of those who had been part of Elbridge's dark circuits. But it built a public record and created a precedent. A wealthy financier who tried to treat other people's lives as data was now accountable. Victor's life in the new configuration became a cautionary tale. He had choices. He had chosen poorly. The criminal justice system punished him within its scales and offered a small, grudging route out in the form of cooperation. He left the public record with a reduced sentence and a new location. The estate paid for counseling for staff who had felt exposed. Vanessa's files were used in ongoing investigations, and she too retreated into a life that carried the stain of what she had done. For Amara, the final steady joy was not in the courtroom or in a press release. It was in small restorations. A new after-school program funded by the estate for children in the neighborhood. A system that allowed a housekeeper to flag vendor discrepancies without fear of reprisal. A new gardener who was paid fairly and whose schedule did not mirror the no-name contracts that had once been a pathway for surveillance. It was in the fact that she could walk through the hallways and be looked at not as an invisible object, but as a person who had agency. On a late spring morning after the legal storm had quieted, the estate hosted a small open house for local foster families. Tables were set by volunteers, and there were games on the lawn. Amara arrived early with a tray of cooling scones and a notebook in her bag, not because she planned to watch for danger, but because she liked to note small moments of human connection. Children ran between the arms of people who were not their blood, but whose hands were kind. Marcus had brought a group of friends who were organizing a community garden. Eli showed off a picture he had drawn, a crooked spaceship that made everyone laugh. Charles came up behind her at the garden's edge. He watched the small chaos of the open house with a softened face. He put his hand on her shoulder, the same steadying touch he had once used in the suite. "You did this," he said, but it did not sound like a claim. It sounded like acknowledgement. Amara smiled and reached into her cardigan for a small thing she had carried since the first morning she had straightened Charles's tie, a ribbon from Elena's journal, frayed at the edges, a child's doodle tucked into the spine. She left it on a small bench by the garden that bore Elena's name. Then she sat down on the bench and opened the notebook. She thought of ties, knots in their meanings. How often had a tie been a sign of someone else's will? How often had a knot been straightened to make a man feel in control? Once, her touch on a tie had been a message in a tiny, urgent language. "Don't go." That whisper had bent a life away from an immediate threat. Now the motif had settled into a different register. A reminder that small gestures carried meaning, and that what started as domestic labor could become moral labor. A child came and sat next to her and pointed to a drawing of a sun on the page. Amara smoothed the paper with a finger and felt in that simple motion a continuity she had not expected. She was still a keeper of small things. She had only broadened what those small things could protect. The estate did not become perfect, nor did any single conviction right the wrongs that had been done. The network Kane had built did not dissolve overnight. Other men in other rooms would always be tempted to buy silence. But the system had shown resilience. The structures that allowed exploitation were now being scrutinized, and the people who had been invisible were beginning to occupy seats of authority. Late one evening, after a board meeting in which Amara had quietly, decisively, argued for a new clause in vendor contracts, she found Eli asleep on the sofa with a small tie of his own tangled like a child's promise. I straightened it for him, fingers fluent, and then, on impulse, straightened a tie on Charles's coat as he passed her in the hall. He caught her hand at the knot and smiled. It was an old, simple ritual, and it felt like a benediction.
She kept a small, private line in her notebook near the back. Visibility has teeth. Under it she wrote, because she had to translate the idea into a living sentence. To be seen is to be accountable, both merciful and dangerous. She underlined it twice. The last image the estate offered her before she left the office that night was the bench with Elena's plaque, lit by a street lamp that made the letters glow like an answer. Amara sat there a moment and put the journal on her lap. She thought of her brother and of the child who had scrawled sons, and of the woman, Vanessa, who had traded power for anonymity and now tried a different life. She thought of Margaret's steady voice and Daniel's blunt loyalty. She thought of a man who had been saved from a suitcase with a gun because she had decided once to speak.
She had once learned that silence kept her safe. She had also learned that silence could protect wrongdoers. She had chosen, in small increments and in dangerous leaps that were always aligned with lawful actors, to trade a portion of her invisibility for a chance at repair. The cost had been high. Fear, exposure, long nights, and the reward was not a banner, but the braided, stubborn work of change. When she rose, she tucked Elena's ribbon into her bag. The night wind moved across the lawns like a rumor. Her hands were those of a woman who had set straight more than ties. She had set in the slow grind of accountability a new standard. There was still much to do. There would be new loopholes to find, new men who believed they could stitch privacy into power. Amara did not believe justice was finished, but she believed, with a cautious, patient hope that had been earned, that visibility, when wielded with care and law, could bite back, and that ordinary people, when seen and heard, could become the instruments of their own safety. Which moment surprised you most? Tell us below.